Reach them all. Almost every promise to bring free education to the world hides the same quiet assumption that the learner already has a screen, a signal, and the ability to read what appears on it. More than 2 billion people have none of those. They are the rural grandmother, the worker who left school too early, and the child a long walk from any classroom. For them, the most beautiful website ever built may as well be on the moon. This book is about reaching them anyway, and it argues that we can with two humble tools that already exist. The first is a phone call, not a smartphone, not an app, not a data plan, just a number anyone can dial to talk out loud with a free tutor in their own language any hour of the day. No reading required. The second is a box, a small, inexpensive computer that holds an entire university and broadcasts it over its own signal to any phone nearby, with no internet at all. It cannot be switched off from far away. When the grid is cut, the box keeps teaching. Neither tool is futuristic, and that is the point. The barrier was never technology. The barrier was will, the decision to spend our cleverness on the people who are hardest to reach instead of the people who are easiest to sell to. This book calls those who make that decision people of goodwill, and it defines goodwill plainly, not a warm feeling, but a choice that a stranger you will never meet is worth helping anyway. What follows is part manifesto and part field guide. It makes the case with real evidence, and it ends with the actual steps to build a box and give it away so that the work does not depend on any one person. One founder cannot reach the world. 10,000 people of goodwill, each carrying a phone number and a box, can. Pack the knowledge, give it away. Let's reach them all. Dr. Jean A. Constant, Chapter 1, The 2 Billion Left Behind, the Global Education Divide. The divide begins with a misunderstanding that has become almost polite. We speak as if education is a ladder placed in the middle of the world, and all anyone must do is climb. We use words like access and opportunity as if they were air, present everywhere and breathed in equally. But education has never been evenly distributed, and in the modern era, the unfairness has taken on a strangely precise shape. It is not simply that some people have schools and others do not. It is that the very systems we now call universal often do not even see the people they miss. On one side of the line are those for whom learning is abundant. If they want to know how the heart works, they can watch a lecture before breakfast. If they want to learn a language, they can hear a native speaker at the touch of a button. If they are curious about history or physics or farming or law, they are rarely more than a few seconds away from an explanation, a video, a book, or a forum of strangers willing to help. They can be self-taught in ways that previous centuries would have called miraculous. On the other side are those whose world is still defined by scarcity. Not the romantic scarcity of quiet and simplicity, but the hard scarcity of missing basics, missing books, missing teachers, missing time, missing safety, missing electricity. For them, knowledge does not wait behind a search bar. It must arrive as a person, a rumor, a borrowed page, a memory. And when it does not arrive, the consequence is not inconvenience. It is a life that stays narrower than it needs to be. The simplest way to describe the global education divide is to say that it is geographic and economic, and of course it is. Rural places tend to have fewer schools, poor places tend to have fewer trained teachers, conflict zones tend to lose everything first, including the quiet needed for study. But that is only the surface. Beneath those familiar facts is a more unsettling truth. The divide is now also technological and linguistic, and most painfully, literate against illiterate. It is a divide that maps onto the body itself. If your eyes can read, the world opens. If they cannot, the modern world becomes a wall of symbols that might as well be locked doors. This is why the number we began with matters so much. More than 2 billion people have a phone, but not the modern internet. They exist in a place that many policy papers treat as a temporary condition, as if the last mile is simply waiting to be paved, as if everyone is already on the same road and some are just delayed. But for a great many of these 2 billion, the delay is not short. It is generational. It is structural. It is built into the way money flows, the way infrastructure is prioritized, the way companies choose markets, and the way governments govern. Even where a signal exists, the cost of using it can be a daily decision between learning and lunch. And the phone they do have is often not the sleek device we picture in advertisements. It is a basic handset with a small screen that was never meant to carry the weight of a modern education. Sometimes it is shared among a family. Sometimes it is kept off most of the time to preserve battery because there is nowhere reliable to charge it. Sometimes it is used only for brief calls because minutes cost money and money is thin. The phone is there, yes, but it is not an on-ramp to the gleaming world of apps and online courses. For millions, it is a lifeline used sparingly, not a portal used freely. The divide shows itself in classrooms first. In wealthy regions, a classroom may have a library, a computer lab, trained teachers, and an assumption that a student will go on to further education. In poor regions, a classroom can be a room without glass in the windows, a chalkboard worn to gray, and a single teacher with 60 students and 3 textbooks. In some places, the classroom is not a room at all. It is a tree. It is a shed. It is a patch of shade where a volunteer tries to do what a nation should have done. But the divide does not stop at the school door. Because in many of the places we are talking about, the school door is where learning ends. The student goes home to a house with no books. There is no quiet corner to study. There may be work to do immediately, water to carry, and younger siblings to mind. A parent who never learned to read cannot help with homework, even if they long to. An older sibling who left school early may believe, with resignation rather than cruelty, that learning is something some people do and others do not. When education is scarce, it becomes fragile. It breaks easily under the weight of life. And this is where the divide becomes cruel in a way that statistics hide. The people most likely to be cut off from learning are often those for whom learning would have the greatest effect. A small increase in literacy for an adult who has none changes everything. The ability to read a medicine label, a contract, a ballot, or a safety sign. A little financial understanding prevents a predatory loan. A basic grasp of health prevents a preventable death. A few months of language instruction open the possibility of work that was previously sealed off. In places where the margin is thin, knowledge has a higher value per ounce than we can easily comprehend from a comfortable distance. We often talk about global education as if it were primarily a children's issue, as if the story were about building more schools, training more teachers, and getting more children into seats. Those things matter profoundly, and no honest person would dismiss them. But the global education divide is also an adult story, a story of people who were failed once and are rarely offered a second chance. The world has a habit of treating adult illiteracy like a finished tragedy, something to be pitied and then ignored. Yet adulthood is where the consequences of ignorance bite the hardest, in work, in parenting, in health, and in navigating systems designed by and for the literate. This is why the 2 tools introduced in the foreword are not a gimmick and not a retreat from modernity. They are a direct answer to the shape of the divide. If the divide were simply about building more websites, we would have solved it already. If it were simply about making better apps, we would not be talking about the last mile. The divide persists because the threshold for modern digital learning is too high. It assumes a screen and data and power and literacy. That stack of assumptions quietly excludes the very people we claim to care about. Consider the quiet violence of a login screen to someone who cannot read. It is not merely confusing, it is humiliating. It tells them, without words they can parse, this is not for you. Consider the way so many educational platforms begin with create an account, verify your email, and enter your password, as if these are neutral steps rather than gates. Even when content is free, access is not. The cost is paid in prerequisite skills and infrastructure. The global education divide is also a language divide. A child may live in a country where the official language used in school is not the language spoken at home. A parent may have knowledge to share, but not in the language the exam demands. Many of the world's best educational resources exist in a few dominant languages, and even where translation exists, it often exists as text. But for a person who cannot read fluently, written translation is not translation at all. The message has been delivered to the wrong door. This is why a voice matters. A voice crosses thresholds that text cannot. It can teach without requiring literacy first. It can carry tone, patience, encouragement, and correction. It can meet a learner where they are, in the language they think in, using the metaphors of their daily life. When we later speak of Gino, the universal tutor who answers in 32 languages, that feature is not decoration. It is a bridge built precisely over the language chasm that keeps so many outside the library. And the divide is not only about remote villages, though those are real and numerous. It exists inside cities too, hidden in plain sight. In the shadow of gleaming towers, there are neighborhoods where families share one phone, where data is purchased in tiny amounts, where a child studies by the light of a shop sign through the window, where a parent works 2 jobs and has never been taught the skills that would let them earn more. The modern world likes to imagine that cities are automatically connected. In reality, the last mile wins through alleys and stairwells as well as across deserts. What is most striking when you listen carefully to stories from the far side of the divide is not a lack of intelligence. It is a surplus of determination. People build lives with almost nothing. They fix machines without manuals. They raise children without safety nets. They survive systems that would break the comfortable. When such people ask for education, they are not asking for a luxury. They are asking for a tool that makes their effort finally pay off. They are asking for the world to stop requiring credentials and resources they were never given a fair chance to obtain. So the global education divide is not merely a problem of distribution. It is a problem of design. We designed education to flow through channels that serve the already served. We designed the modern library to assume the modern reader, the modern device, and the modern connection. Then we looked at the people left outside and treated their exclusion as unfortunate but inevitable. It is not inevitable. The last mile has waited a long time, but it is not impassable. If the world's knowledge can be carried by a voice over an ordinary phone line and stored in a small box that makes its own signal, then the divide begins to look less like a law of nature and more like a decision. In the pages ahead, we will make that decision explicit. We will name the barriers for what they are, not mysteries, but solvable constraints, and we will begin, step by practical step, to build for the person with the least. Because the measure of a truly global education is not what it offers to the best connected among us. It is whether it reaches the ones the screen forgot. Invisible barriers to learning. The last mile is not only a matter of distance. It is made of small, quiet obstacles that add up until learning becomes something you watch other people do. When we say barriers, we tend to picture the obvious ones. A school that is too far away, a fee that is too high, a civil war that makes attendance dangerous. Those are real, and in many places they are decisive. But some of the most stubborn walls are the ones no one puts on a map. They are the invisible barriers to learning. The soft barriers, the administrative barriers, the design barriers, and the shame barriers. They are the kind that allow a society to claim education is available, while the people left out have no practical way to touch it. One of the strangest features of modern education is how often it begins with an assumption that feels morally neutral to the designer and utterly disqualifying to the learner. Just click here. Just fill out this form. Just make an account. The word just does an enormous amount of damage. It smuggles in the idea that the step is minor, that everyone can do it, that failing to do it is a personal weakness rather than a predictable outcome of exclusion. For the 2 billion living beyond the modern internet, the first invisible barrier is often not the lack of content, but the architecture of access. Even when something is free, it may still require a device that can display it properly, a stable connection long enough to load it, and a level of comfort with interfaces that only comes from practice. A person who has never used a browser does not experience a website as intuitive. They experience it as a wall that rearranges itself every time they touch it. The barrier can be as small as a password. Passwords are normal to those of us who grew up with them, but they are a kind of private literacy. They require typing, memory, and a sense of how systems work. In many households on the far side of the divide, phones are shared. A password is not only hard, it is impractical. People forget it, children change it. A cousin borrows the phone and locks everyone out, and soon the free education becomes one more thing that works for other people. Even the idea of an email address, so basic it barely registers to the connected world, can be an invisible gate. An email address assumes repeated access to the internet, the ability to read and write at least a little, and a sense of personal digital identity. It assumes you have a stable you in a system that recognizes you. Many people in rural poverty live without that kind of continuity. They change phone numbers as SIM cards come and go. They lose devices, they borrow devices. They do not build a digital life because building one is a luxury. And so when a platform says verify your email, it is not asking for a simple step. It is asking for a kind of modern citizenship. Then there is the barrier of time, which is almost never mentioned in glossy education plans. Learning requires hours that are protected from urgent survival. The wealthy can pretend time is elastic. The poor know it is rigid. If water must be carried, it will be carried. If a shift must be worked, it will be worked. If younger siblings must be watched, they will be watched. Education in such a life does not compete with leisure. It competes with necessities, and necessities win without malice. A child may be enrolled in school and still miss half the lessons because the household cannot spare them that day. An adult may desperately want to learn to read and still never find a quiet hour when their mind is not already exhausted. This leads to another barrier that hides in plain sight: fatigue. We imagine learning as an act of fresh attention, the mind sitting upright at a desk, ready. But many of the people we are talking about try to learn at the end of a day that has already taken everything. The worker who wants to study is not simply unmotivated when they struggle, they are tired in their bones. The mother who nods off over a lesson is not indifferent, she is running on borrowed sleep. Any system built for the best hours of the day, on the assumption of comfort, will quietly fail the people who only have the scraps of the day left to give. Infrastructure, too, is not a single barrier, but a stack of invisible ones. Electricity is an obvious need, but its unreliability creates subtler problems. A device that cannot be charged consistently becomes a device that must be conserved. Conserved devices are not used for exploration. They are used for essentials: a call to an employer, a message about a sick relative, a quick check-in that must not drain the battery. Spend an hour watching this lesson is not a reasonable instruction in a home where every percentage point of charge is being weighed against risk. Even where electricity exists, it may cost money, require a trip, or depend on a neighborhood generator that runs only at certain hours. Those conditions shape learning more than most educational designers ever have to consider. Language is another invisible barrier, precisely because it is sometimes mistaken for a solved problem. We live in an era of translation buttons, subtitles, and international media, and it creates the illusion that language is no longer a primary divider. But most education still arrives in a handful of dominant languages, and it arrives primarily as text. A learner may understand spoken versions of those languages, but not read them. Or they may speak a local language at home and face schooling in an official language that is not the language of their thoughts. The result is a quiet humiliation: being intelligent in one tongue and treated as slow in another. The barrier here is not simply vocabulary, it is confidence. A person may be willing to ask a question in the language of their mother, but not in the language of bureaucracy. They may fear being laughed at, corrected harshly, or dismissed. And once a learner begins to associate questions with embarrassment, curiosity becomes dangerous. Curiosity goes underground. They stop asking. Education, at its root, is the freedom to ask without fear. Many people have never been given that freedom. This is where shame becomes one of the most powerful invisible barriers of all. Adult illiteracy is often hidden, even within families. People develop clever ways to conceal it, memorizing the shape of a medicine bottle rather than reading the label, asking a child to check something on a form, nodding at instructions, and hoping they can figure it out later. Every concealment is understandable. Every concealment also keeps the person alone with the problem. A system that requires a public admission of ignorance, standing in line at an office, or sitting in a classroom full of younger students will fail many adults, not because they do not want to learn, but because they cannot bear the exposure. Institutions often deepen this barrier unintentionally. Schools and offices can be impatient places, designed for throughput rather than care. A clerk behind a window may not have the time to explain a form slowly. A teacher with 60 students may not have the time to notice the one who is lost. People then learn the lesson that asking for help makes you a burden. Once that lesson is internalized, barriers become self-reinforcing. The world grows full of locked doors that the learner does not even try to open. There is also the barrier of bureaucracy, which is not only paperwork, but also the need to be legible to systems. Many educational benefits require documents: identification, proof of residence, birth certificates, and transcripts. Those requirements sound reasonable in a stable society. They become traps in a society where papers are lost to floods, fire, displacement, or simple poverty. The world forgets how many people live without tidy records. A child without a birth certificate may be denied enrollment. An adult without formal schooling may be denied training programs that require prerequisites they never had the chance to earn. A displaced family may be denied everything because they cannot prove who they are on paper, even though their lives are written plainly on their faces. These barriers are invisible to those who do not live with them because they do not announce themselves as cruelty. They announce themselves as normal procedure, as standard design, as common sense. That is what makes them so effective. They allow the comfortable world to keep its conscience. The course was free. The resources were online. The school exists. And in a narrow technical sense, those statements can be true, while in a human sense, they are meaningless. A ladder placed behind a fence is still a ladder, but it is not a way up. The purpose of naming invisible barriers is not to rehearse despair. It is to get specific about what must change if we are serious about reaching everyone. The moment we see the barriers, we can see why the two tools introduced in the foreword are shaped the way they are. A voice on a phone line is not merely convenient. It steps around literacy. It steps around passwords. It steps around shame because a person can ask privately in their own language without an audience. A small offline box that broadcasts a library is not merely clever. It steps around data costs, outages, censorship, and the fragile dependence on distant infrastructure. These tools are answers not to a vague problem called access, but to the precise shape of exclusion as it actually exists. If we want to reach the people the screen forgot, we must stop treating the modern connected learner as the default human. The default human, globally speaking, is still someone for whom learning must fit into a life of constraint. When education is designed for that person, the invisible barriers begin to fall away. Not because we have solved poverty overnight or paved every road, but because we have finally stopped placing the door at the top of the staircase. We have put it on the ground where everyone can reach the handle. Why reaching everyone matters. If the first two sections of this chapter have sounded like diagnoses, it is because the problem deserves to be named plainly. But the reason to name it is not to admire the shape of the wound. The reason is to decide, without flinching, whether we will treat it. That decision is what this section is about. Why does reaching everyone matter when the world is already full of people learning online, graduating from universities, inventing, publishing, and prospering? Why not accept, with a shrug dressed up as realism, that some places will always be behind? Because behind is not a location on a map. It is a verdict. And once a society becomes comfortable leaving whole populations behind, it begins to rot in ways that the connected world cannot fully insulate itself from. Begin with the simplest moral truth, the one we often avoid because it sounds too basic to repeat. Education is not merely a service. It is a form of recognition. To teach someone is to say, "You are worth my time. Your mind is worth building." When 2 billion people are treated as unreachable, it is not only their income that is limited or their careers that are narrowed. It is their human standing that is quietly diminished. The modern world does not say this out loud. It says it with design. It says it with login screens, with paywalls, with interfaces built as if literacy and bandwidth were natural facts rather than distributed privileges. It says, in effect, we built the library, but not for you. A person can live a long time under that message and begin to believe it. That is one of the hidden reasons adult illiteracy is so hard to repair. It is not only the absence of skill, but also the presence of resignation. Resignation is not laziness, it is the scar tissue that forms when effort has not been rewarded. If we want to understand why reaching everyone matters, we have to see that education is not just about information. It is about restoring the link between effort and outcome. It is about making the world feel responsive again. The practical consequences of not reaching everyone are easier to measure. They show up in health first, because health is where knowledge becomes survival. A person who cannot read a dosage label is not uninformed in an abstract way. They are at risk. A parent who cannot interpret a fever, understand dehydration, or spot the signs of a complication is not behind the times. They are forced to gamble with a child's body. In places where clinics are far and medicines are often sold without careful instruction, basic health education delivered in plain language can be the difference between recovery and tragedy. When we leave people outside learning, we do not merely leave them outside careers, we leave them outside safely. Then there is money, the daily mathematics of living. The connected world often treats financial literacy as an elective topic, something you pick up if you're curious. For the poor, it is not an elective, it is armor. Interest rates, loan terms, predatory contracts, wage theft, and scams dressed as opportunity, these are not occasional irritations. They are the terrain. An adult who cannot read well is easier to exploit, and exploitation is not a side effect of inequality. It is one of its engines. When we reach a person with practical education, we do not simply help them improve themselves. We reduce the power others have to steal from them legally and openly. And once you see that, you can no longer treat the 2 billion as a charity case. They are a population living under a constant extraction tax, and one of the few tools that reliably reduces that tax is knowledge. Not knowledge in the lofty sense alone, though that matters too, but knowledge that fits into a life. How to compare prices, how to read a contract, how to calculate interest, how to protect a wage, how to understand a diagnosis. The world is full of people who are working as hard as anyone, often harder, and still losing because the rules are written in a language they were never taught. Reaching them is not about giving them a gift. It is about giving them a fair fight. There is also a national cost, though it is rarely framed that way. A country does not become wealthy by having a handful of educated elites connected to global markets while millions remain undertaught. That creates a fragile economy and a brittle politics. When education is unevenly distributed, the society becomes easier to destabilize. Rumor replaces explanation. Conspiracy replaces understanding. Demagogues thrive wherever people have never been taught to test a claim, to ask what evidence supports it, to compare sources, or to notice when they are being manipulated. You do not need everyone to become a scholar, but you do need enough people to be able to tell the difference between truth and a story designed to inflame them. This is one of the quiet shocks of the modern era. The same technologies that deliver the world's knowledge can also deliver the world's lies. And the people least equipped to defend themselves are often the people least served by formal schooling. When education fails, misinformation becomes not a nuisance, but a governing force. So reaching everyone matters not only for individual dignity, but also for social stability. A population that can reason is harder to tyrannize. That word tyrannize may sound dramatic, but it is not theoretical. When learning depends entirely on the modern internet, whoever controls the internet controls the flow of knowledge. Even in places with good connectivity, the connection can be cut, it can be throttled, it can be made expensive, it can be monitored until people are afraid to search. In places with weak connectivity, control is even easier. A single policy, a single outage, a single act of sabotage can darken entire regions. This is why, later in this book, the second tool will matter so much, a library that cannot be switched off from outside. But the moral point arrives here, early, before the engineering. If knowledge can be turned off like a faucet, then knowledge has not yet been made a right. It is still a privilege granted by infrastructure and permission. Reaching everyone matters because education is the only peaceful, scalable way to increase human freedom. Food aid can keep someone alive. Medical aid can keep them healthy. Both are precious. But education changes what a person can do next. It changes the set of choices available to them, and it changes that set permanently. A person who learns to read is not simply helped for a day. They are unsealed. They can read signs, compare prices, follow instructions, learn from a manual, understand a ballot, and teach someone else. Literacy is one of the few interventions that pounds inside a household. It spreads, it breeds capability, and it spreads in ways we do not always anticipate. When a mother learns to read, her children's chances improve dramatically. Not because she becomes perfect, but because the home environment changes. Labels become legible, school papers become less intimidating, questions become safer to ask, the household becomes more navigable. When an adult learns basic arithmetic, the entire family's vulnerability to small financial traps decreases. When a worker learns a trade concept, they can negotiate wages with more confidence. When a young person learns a little science, they become less susceptible to superstition used as control. Education is not a single ladder climbed alone. It is a set of tools left on the kitchen table where everyone begins to use them. There is a further reason reaching everyone matters, and it has to do with the connected world's own future. The comfortable story is that progress belongs to those already connected, and the rest will be invited in gradually. But the truth is that the 2 billion include immense talent currently trapped behind invisible barriers. Human intelligence is not concentrated in cities with fiber optic cable. Curiosity is not distributed by GDP. The world is leaving inventions uninvented, cures undiscovered, businesses unbuilt, and art unwritten because it has treated whole regions as educational afterthoughts. The cost of exclusion is not only borne by the excluded, it is borne by humanity, which is living with a smaller portion of its own potential. Even if you set aside the moral argument, and even if you set aside compassion as a motive, there is still the plain, self-interested case. Instability spreads, disease spreads, economic shocks spread, disinformation spreads. A planet on which billions of people are systematically undereducated is not a planet where the educated can remain secure behind gates. The last mile is not an exotic problem over there. It is part of the same world system that produces migration, conflict, supply chain fragility, and political extremism. Education is not a sentimental investment, it is infrastructure for peace. And yet, for all these reasons, most efforts still fail at the same place, the threshold. They assume a screen, they assume text, they assume stable power. They assume the learner can step into the modern system without help, when in reality, the modern system is the very thing that has been excluding them. The earlier sections named the invisible barriers. Here is the conclusion that follows. If reaching everyone matters, then the method must match the reality of the excluded. That is why the 2 tools introduced in the foreword are not side projects. They are the logical outcome of taking everyone seriously. A voice on a phone line meets people where they already are. It uses the most widespread device on Earth, and it makes literacy a goal rather than a prerequisite. A small offline box of knowledge, broadcasting its own signal, treats connectivity as something you can bring with you rather than something you must beg from distant infrastructure. These are not futuristic fantasies. They are humble, almost old-fashioned in their simplicity, and that is precisely why they can cross the last mile. But before we get to the details of those tools, pause on what reaching everyone really means. It does not mean uploading another course and declaring victory. It means designing so that the person with the least can still enter. It means refusing to treat the hardest to reach as optional. It means measuring success not by how impressive the content looks to the already educated, but by whether a grandmother who never learned to read can make her first step without shame, and whether a child in a room the internet has never entered can still touch a library. The world has grown used to education as a privilege that pretends to be universal. This book is built on a different premise. If education is a human right, then it must be deliverable under human conditions, not ideal conditions. The 2 billion are not a footnote to the story of modern learning. They are the test of whether we meant what we said when we used the word universal. Reaching them all matters because anything less is not only incomplete but also dishonest. And because once you build for the person with the least, you discover something hopeful. You have built something strong enough to serve everyone. The magic of 6 in the land of the free. For every book we offer, GSU employs a multifaceted learning framework we call the Magic of 6 and the Land of the Free. Video summaries. a concise, narrated visual walkthrough covering the first of the book's 12 chapters. Audio podcasts, full read-aloud audio versions of the initial chapter. Educational games, score-based, repetitive learning games that ensure education feels like play. You can log in 24/7 and pick up exactly where you left off. Free digital books, downloadable digital copies of the complete books to keep at absolutely no cost. Gino the AI Tutor, a dedicated patient artificial intelligence tutor you can converse with at any time of day or night. Comprehension Certification, a free certification program earned by progressing down a learning path we call Trifurcation Road. Our global mission. Currently, GSU is available in English, Spanish, and simplified Chinese. Fueled by our Amazon book sales and the generosity of our donors, we are actively working to expand our offerings into 32 languages, ensuring accessible, real-world education for anyone, anywhere in the world.